Why won't anyone talk to me?
Hey guys, welcome back to yet another devlog tutorial from my upcoming Udemy course on a Zelda-like top-down RPG. So far, we have a character, we have a world, we even have NPCs. But let's be honest, NPCs you can't interact with, it's kind of pointless. So we're gonna need a dialogue system.
Shall we play a game?
If you remember from The Legend of Zelda, the dialogue system is kind of lacking. Most people have no idea what the story was actually about in Zelda. And I think it's because the dialogue system sucked. Zelda's dialogue is lame, so I thought I'd aim a little higher. Tell me, have you ever played Celeste? You know, everyone always praises this game for how great the player controller is. And you know what? I have no arguments there. But to be honest, I was always more impressed with the dialogue system. Celeste has a very immersive storyline, but if they hadn't spent so much time and energy on the dialogue system, it would have fallen flat. What makes this dialogue system so great? Well, every character in the game has its own personalized dialogue box. This includes individual backgrounds and character portraits that animate. It also has a clean UI with interactive text. That text is not only multicolored, but it's also animated. It also has an indicator when there's more text to be displayed and requires player input. But the most immersive part of this system is not just that it looks pretty, it's the feedback you get according to each character's emotion. This is displayed when the character portrait animations change according to what mood they're feeling. And also the text animates according to that mood as well. But the granddaddy of all attributes of the Celeste dialogue system has to be the gibberish sound effect that the sound designer used for each character, which is also different according to the specific emotion the character is feeling. This dialogue system has a lot going for it, which as you can imagine, garners a lot of attention from the game development community. And this is when I made a decision that should show you all how big of an idiot I really am. I decided I was going to reverse engineer that dialogue system from Celeste and put it into my game. I wondered, how hard could it really be? John, you naive, ignorant peasant. Before I get into the details of how I attempted to tackle all these problems, I should probably first point out some of the things that I didn't think about until I was well into the process. First, Celeste dialogue is linear. And what I mean by this is when the characters cut into dialogue, you're actually watching a cutscene. These cutscenes only load at certain parts of the level when the player has progressed far enough. The player doesn't really have a choice on who they want to talk to. They're just along for the ride. This can work for a platformer game where you pretty much only go left or right, but that's not how a top-down RPG works. In The Legend of Zelda, the player has the freedom to pretty much go and talk to whoever they want to talk to, whenever they want to talk to them, which means the player can decide who they want to talk to, and what happens when they decide they're talking to the wrong person and want to leave the conversation. You can't do that in Celeste. Nobody enjoys the feeling you get when you're trapped in a never-ending conversation. It's like talking to an old person about the good old days.
But enough about me. I hope this hasn't been boring for you. It's just that whenever I start to talk about Elaine, I always get so carried away. I lose all track of time.
Why won't you stop talking to me?
For a system like the one presented in Celeste to be used in my game, I'm gonna need some kind of option to allow the player to leave that conversation whenever they want, which makes the dialogue system that much more complicated because having choices means that you now have the potential to enter into
A multiverse!
But there's one more little issue that proved to be extremely confusing on how I was going to tackle it. Once again, Celeste is a 2D platformer that uses cutscenes, and my game is top-down, which means that the characters in Celeste are always positioned to have a conversation. What happens when I engage in a conversation who's walking away from me, for example? Does that mean that we have a conversation like we're in a soap opera? I'm leaving you for your sister. What? Also, what if I'm accidentally standing right on top of that NPC when I'm trying to have that conversation?
I'm standing uncomfortably close to you so that I know you can hear me.
I not only need to make sure that player is standing in an acceptable location for dialogue, people have a space bubble, yo. I need to make sure the characters are facing each other in every circumstance. But I also wanted to have a few more added features. For example, if the player is standing to the left or to the right of the NPC, I want them to have the very same thing reflected in the dialogue boxes. I also want my character game objects to have talking animations while they're talking. Among all the obvious challenges, there's one more thing that, you've probably forgotten about at this point. I'm using Bolt visual scripting as the backbone of this build. And if you've ever used Bolt, then you know that there's tons of information on how to use Bolt. Not. So this is what I did. For the core mechanic of this system, I knew I was going to need a lot of characters and a lot of conversations. So even though I'm using Bolt visual scripting, I decided to use scriptable objects. And there is a very helpful tutorial video using scriptable objects in C# that I really watched carefully when designing this build. Now you may be wondering, what, pray tell, is a scriptable object? A scriptable object is a C# script that serves as a template for creating and storing valuable information in a Spectre window. So for example, because I was going to need a lot of characters, I defined a character scriptable object that allowed me to store information about that character. For example, here I'm storing information about the character's name, which dialog box to use, and what emotions that character will have, and what sprite should be displayed when they have that emotion. So my main character is going to have a little bit more depth than the NPCs, so for him I created 8 different emotions using Adobe Illustrator, and each of my NPCs I only created 3. I also designed a unique dialog box for each character, and I stored the corresponding sprites and all the information inside that character's scriptable object. For the conversation scriptable object, I needed a little bit more information that needed to be stored. Who are the characters that are involved in this conversation? Are they on the left or the right? How many lines of dialogue are going to be said? Who is going to be speaking that line? What emotion will they have whenever they're speaking? And finally, will there be a choice that the player has to make? The choice scriptable object is relatively simple. If this isn't well thought out though, it can actually be a nightmare. Each opportunity will create a choice that will have 3 options. Option 1, Option 2, and of course the leave conversation option where the player can leave whenever they want. If you're going to create a choice-based dialogue system, I strongly recommend that you diagram that conversation as I have here. This, for example, is one conversation. Diagramming the conversations can be extremely helpful so that you don't get lost in what part of the conversation is supposed to go where. For my diagrams, I used draw.io, which is a free resource that's available for everybody. I then got to designing the overall UI that I stored in a new scene that I will add onto the current scene when the characters are talking. Not only do I have a dialogue manager that carries out all the complex functions for each speaker, I also have a left speaker and a right speaker dialogue box. When the corresponding speaker has dialogue, the dialogue box needs to animate in, so I used an animation controller to bring the dialogue box in, and of course when the character is done speaking, it animates out in reverse. And when that animation is complete, I used animation triggers to tell the text when to appear. For the text, I used the Text Mesh Pro asset, which is also free for everyone to use. Text Mesh Pro takes a font asset and it creates a mesh out of it, which we can think of as like a corresponding image for each character of text. Another great feature of the Text Mesh Pro asset that many people don't know about is that it uses HTML rich text tags, which if you have all the text displayed all at once, it's not really that big a deal. But for example, if you want to use a typewriter effect, you can actually run into an issue. It starts typing out the tag, and then when it's displayed, it's like, oh crap, that was a tag. Sorry about that. Using a macro that I created called display text, you can actually use Bolt visual scripting to constantly update the mesh so that you can use rich text tags. And if this is all you want, Bolt can do all of this. But if you want this text to animate, this is where you might consider an alternative solution. If you're going to create your own tags for animation, then you need a parsing system put into place, which isn't that big of a deal. It can be done. But what sucks about Bolt is that if you start animating these characters of text, it causes some pretty serious frame rate issues. And I think the reason why is that to update the mesh for movement and animation using C#, it doesn't require that much memory. It's just code that's carried out. But with Bolt, it's not only carrying out code, it's animating the diagrams and sending signals from one node to the next. And this slowed down my computer significantly, and I've got a pretty good one. I'm not satisfied with just having typewriter text and HTML tags. I wanted my text to animate or display emotion to draw attention to specific parts of that text. So this is what I ended up doing. Normally, I steer away from using assets in the Unity Asset Store because most of the time, I buy crap that I don't need, or I buy stuff that I have absolutely no idea how to use, let alone work on, which really makes me feel like the ass in asset. In this situation though, I got the text animator asset. This asset is well worth the $25, and icing on the cake, I got it while it was 50% off during the spring sale event. Even better. This system has several pre-built configurations, it's very easy to use, and it also has the ability to easily create new tags for the built-in parsing system and new effects if I should need them in the future. Just a note from my Udemy course, I will show both how to create the dialogue system using Bolt and how to implement this asset. But I also needed the choices to display on the screen. So when the text is complete and it's waiting on the player's input, in this case spacebar, I animated a little bouncing arrow on the screen to indicate that there is more to be displayed. And when the character hits the spacebar, the text shrinks with another animation and the choices display on the screen. And of course, when the player selects the choice, I have code in Bolt firing the next appropriate conversation. And to give the player the feeling that they aren't trapped in an endless conversation, I also gave them the ability to spam the spacebar to complete the text if it wasn't finished. Come on, shut up already! It was then time to focus on the part that you're likely waiting for. The sound. When you listen to Celeste dialogue, it sounds like random gibberish. And in a way, it sort of is. But there is actually a method to the madness. These conversations are not preloaded, there is an algorithm on how it's accomplished. While scouring the internet on how it was done, I ran across this Reddit post, and I'll put a link in the description below if you're interested. In it, there is not only a 4-hour-long video the sound designer had on Twitch going through every sound clip in the game, you will also find a pretty detailed explanation of how exactly they accomplished all these steps, and not only that, they actually give you all the sound files for educational purposes. Man, these guys are my heroes. So how does all this work? Well, first of all, they didn't use a generic sound manager like the one implemented in Unity. They used a free asset called Fmod. Now, I don't know if you know what Fmod is. Seriously, go watch some YouTube videos on it because not only is it free and usable with Unity, it is incredible. If you're not using Fmod, you're dumber than a big old dummy. And I don't have time to get into all of this, but let me just say, I'm going to be using this when I come back around to sound in my game because it is super cool. Using Fmod, they set up several parameters like a giant state machine. With it, they not only have the ability to start and stop a conversation with code, but to randomly select sound clips according to those parameters. They also use these parameters to fire what emotion the character talking was feeling. But for the sound clips themselves, this is where things get a little tedious. They split the dialogue into 3 major sections. Clips, which can be used as kind of consonant sounds, and then the longer sound clips for vowel enunciation and sentence endings. Creating the first section was relatively easy. I just got a MIDI keyboard off Amazon and plugged it into my MacBook with GarageBand and selected some synths that I wanted to use for the voice. But getting these synths to enunciate vowel sounds is where things get a little tricky. I actually purchased an audio unit add-on for GarageBand called the Orb. And with this add-on, you could use any sound that you want to make vowel sounds automatically. I then recorded myself pounding on the keyboard like a giant ape, and then I took these clips to my main PC and cut them up and edited them so that I could put them into appropriate categories. Short, quick consonant sounds, medium vowel enunciations, and an ending where the vowel and pitch dropped in the clip. I then triggered these conversations to fire the Fmod parameters when the conversation starts and ends. Using this system, I could also change the sound according to what emotion the player is feeling. Now, I'm not really ready to get into the sound implementation of my game, and so for the purpose of this video, you notice that my characters have the same voice. But this is the final result. So what do you think? Do you think I successfully created the Celeste dialogue system? Or do you think this was a complete and total failure? Maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, Mega, that doesn't sound as good as the audio used in Celeste. Well, to that I would say, you don't have to be a jerk about it. The Celeste dialogue audio was designed by professional sound engineers. They've worked on 30 major titles and have at least a couple of decades of sound design experience. I've only been at this for a couple weeks. But if you're thinking, you know, Mega, all that looks and sounds awesome, well, then I'd just like to say, you're welcome. You should feel so honored to listen to me talk. In all seriousness, I feel really, really stupid at this point. because it's in this system that I broke one of the cardinal rules of independent game design. Don't overreach.
I have sinned against you, my lord.
Celeste wasn't just made by one person. While the overall concept of the game was created by a couple of guys in the game jam, they actually brought in a whole team of people to help finalize it. Go watch this video if you'd like more information on how they went from independent game programmers to making a fully fledged marketable game that sold millions of copies. Look, I'm just one guy, and I am so tired of looking at this stupid dialogue system. If I had just gone with the lame old Zelda dialogue system, I would probably be close to finishing my enemy NPCs by now. Now, this happens to game developers all the time. We overburden ourselves because everything needs to be as perfectly designed as we imagine it as being in our minds. And we actually get burned out with the work, so we eventually quit developing the game because we just can't accept what we had was good enough. So I've decided I'm not going to be using the Celeste audio voice format for the characters in my game. And since all the other aspects of this dialogue system are established, I will be using it. But when it comes to the individual voices for each character, and each of those characters is supposed to have at least 3 moods, holy crap, man, that's a lot of work. Even the sound designer for Celeste, who only worked on the sound effects for the game, asked himself, why in the world did I think this was a good idea? And he only had to work on like 6 characters. I'm creating an entire game by myself where there could be dozens of characters in a top-down RPG. Screw that. If you're interested in how to set up a voice in Fmod that can be used in a similar format to Celeste, I could do a tutorial video on how this is done so that's not wasted knowledge. But I'm not really going to do that if there's not enough people interested in it. So if you are interested, be sure to leave me a comment in the comment section below. And if you're really interested and want to get started today, maybe you would consider joining my Patreon community. According to your level of support, you could gain early access to my YouTube content. You could gain access to my private Discord channel where you can ask me any question that you like regarding any of my builds. You can take part in online polls, maybe give a shout out in one of my videos, or even download the project files for my complete 2D player controller and complete inventory system. Once again, I'm not doing all this to make a marketable game. Instead, I'm planning on creating a Udemy course where everyone can see the start to finish process of creating a game like Zelda from scratch. The more financial support I get, the less I'll have to focus on other sources of income, and the more quickly I can get this course out. Not to mention, I'm going to make sure all my patrons who supported me along the way either get this course at a heavily discounted rate or completely free according to their level of support. For now, though, it's time for me to say farewell. I hope this video was helpful for you, and if you're all by yourself in game design, learn from my stupid mistake and don't overreach. Anyway, thanks for joining me. My name is Megahertz, and I'm out.